I would like to start adding my own thanks to all those who have been involved in the creation of the Nagulendran Chair in Peace Mediation. First and foremost, I would like to thank Dorothy and John and recognize their courage to take a fork in the road of life and jointly embark on a new project in philanthropy. I am deeply honored to hold a chair carrying your name, and I'm looking forward to what we can achieve together. Thank you. Allow me also to thank the members of the selection and student committees and the board of the Geneva Graduate Institute to accept my nomination for Professor of Practice and Chair. What I would like to offer in this lecture is a reflection about the peace mediation sector in an era of radical uncertainty. When I refer to peace mediation during my lecture, I mean a spectrum of activities that range from high-level peace efforts to targeted problem-solving or community-based approaches. I will argue that the practical key of this sector and the tested instruments and approaches are important for navigating the political landscapes of an era of radical uncertainty. Yet, to assure the full potential of this key, the sector has to adapt or risk being sidelined by the securitization of everything. I have structured my lecture along 4 parts. The first part of my lecture, I will present the contours of the era of radical uncertainty and propose peace mediation practice as an alternative to an exclusive reliance on securitization as a response to radical uncertainty. In the second part, I will demystify peace mediation practice around 3 stories. I think this demystification is important to take the practice out of the shadows and emphasize its most important practical characteristics. In the third part, I will offer a perspective on the current constitution and institutionalization of the peace mediation sector, also as a backdrop to the fourth part, in which we will reflect on continuities exchange necessary for the adaptation of the sector. Friends and colleagues, what a time to hold a chair in peace mediation. Speeches at every global gathering emphasize that we are living in an era of radical uncertainty. We are now all too familiar with the factors shaping this era: pandemics, new diseases, population growth, displacement, and so forth. When these factors converge in specific localities, ever more frequent, widespread, and intense crises become the norm, and we are already seeing how they are overwhelming governance capacity at every level. Let us look together at some of the projections on democracy, climate, and conflict. Only in developing countries, populations will double from 900 million to about 1.8 billion in 2050. Urbanization will increase dramatically, and the IPCC estimates that about 1 billion residents of low-lying cities and settlements will be at risk of coastal-specific climate hazards in the coming decade. There will be significant population movements both in the United States, in China, and many, many, many other countries. This is relatively predictable, it builds on data, and it shows us that we have never known more about the trajectories of future risks, and we should use this knowledge as an engine to adapt our policies and practices today. This is the reason why we are speaking about the adaptation of the peace mediation sector today. When turning to conflict dynamics, we can see a multiplication of different types of violent conflict. Interstate wars and great power competition have grown in intensity recently, and so have the risks of the use of nuclear, chemical, biological, or cyber weaponry. At the same time, however, many other types of violent conflicts have proliferated. Let's look at the most recent results of the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which this figure represents. ACLED registered 50 countries currently experiencing extreme high or turbulent conflict dynamics. Of course, Ukraine and Gaza are on top of the list in the annual reporting, but when you look at the month of July 2024, there are several countries experiencing extreme levels of conflict that are currently not in the public imagination. Myanmar, Syria, Mexico, Nigeria, Colombia, Brazil, Sudan, Cameroon, and Pakistan. Let us also recall, being at the Graduate Institute, the important work of the Small Arms Survey that collects data on the violent deaths. Their results suggest that over 500,000 people die violently every year since at least 2004. That is about one dead person every minute for the last 20 years, or about 10 million people. This evolution of conflict dynamics is not a zero-sum game in which one type of conflict becomes more intense and others decline. Much rather, it builds like a layer cake in which different types of violent conflicts pile on top of each other at different scales from local to global. Not all of these conflicts are always part of the public imagination, and this is why ACLED's geolocated data on violent conflict and protests. It's such an important independent evidence base to accompany peace mediation. The projections on democracy, climate, and conflict describe just 3 of many factors that shape the era of radical uncertainty. However, they are already giving us a sense of the challenge ahead. The era is radical because change is fast and happens at scale. It is uncertain because present instruments and approaches to manage this change are either inadequate or non-existing. When looking at this strategic landscape, therefore, one observation stands out to me. The world will not be able to securitize or militarize its way out of this array of interlocking crises. It needs to find alternative approaches. This is not an anti-security agenda, but an invitation to question the dosage of security and military instrument, if they are the right treatment for the future landscape of conflict and instability. I think the instruments and approaches of the peace mediation sector have a lot to offer to deal with the strategic landscape. They should be elevated more directly into the strategic imaginations of politicians and policymakers. The next part is an attempt of doing just that. I will reflect on 3 stories that illustrate some of the key characteristics of peace mediation. And let's start with the story of Doris Barreto. Doris works at a health facility in Cartuche, one of the most violent parts of one of the most violent cities in the world, which is Caracas in Venezuela. Beyond offering health services for women and girls, Doris facilitated encounters between mothers of killed teenagers and their killers. This work is important because the mother and the killer live in the same neighborhood and see each other several times per day. What she does is to ensure that the mother can live with less grief and the killer can live with less guilt. For me, the story of Doris helps us demystify peace mediation in at least 3 ways. To start with, the story underlines the incredible agency for peace that exists in even some of the most difficult environments possible. I was blessed in the last 20 years to have met many of such outstanding individuals, and they have shaped my own belief that peace is possible. Doris also illustrates that the leaders in the sector are from the societies and regions in which conflict takes place. These individuals belong to a relatively undefined yet global network of peace professionals, which internationals also call insider mediators. My second observation from Doris' story is about the importance of third parties. Professor William Zartman has made this point eloquently. Violent conflicts, he said, are marked by intensity of commitment that unlock the parties into opposition and hostilities, that they cannot reach a turning point of perception and find a way out by themselves. They are unable to communicate with each other, unable to think of a solution that could be attractive to the other side as well as themselves, unable to conceive any side payments or enticements to turn a zero-sum conflict into a positive-sum solution, and unable to turn from commitment and a winning mentality to problem-solving and solution to grievances. End of citation. In the case of Katuce, Doris was that third party that could help nurture a turning point in perceptions between the two sides. She had the trust of both parties and their consent to organize this emotional encounter. My third observation on Doris' story is about something deeper. I think it underlines that nurturing peace really means managing the space of the unforgivable. The pain inflicted through violence leaves deep scars that are marking people for life. So at the heart of working on peace is a sense of respect for the other, of self-consciousness about the bounds of our own moral imagination, and of humility in our ambitions as third parties. Doris' story at the Geneva Peace Talks many years back made me believe in the power of agency for peace and in the ability to construct spaces in which this agency can unfold its force for good. My second story is about an expedition through a mountain range. It is how Professor John Darby explained the characteristics of peace processes. All previous expeditions have failed. There are no obvious paths to the top. The climbers are inexperienced in negotiation and must pick up the skills as they go along. To make matters worse, the mountaineering team is composed of people who have been previously at each other's throat, often literally, and who are now roped together. They must overcome their suspicion and learn to accomplish a common task. For many, the ending of violence is a sufficient objective. If they succeed, a ceasefire may follow. At last, the travelers are able to peer over the summit, but they will not see a tranquil panorama of gentle hills. Instead, the view reveals new mountains, some apparently more formidable than the one just climbed. This story highlights that a pathway to peace is a permanent process. A peace process is a stage within it. In the current imagination about peace process, there is a rather simplistic view that you hold a peace conference and you establish peace by declaration, which means a signature on a piece of paper. But this is really only part of the process of finding a permanent political settlement in which interests are asserted through dialogue, negotiation, and compromise. Let's also recognize in this story the implicit role of third parties as we imagine all the guides and porters helping the expedition through the mountain range. This is a useful image to describe the work of mediation support. That is a core activity of the peace mediation sector. The story also shows that peace mediation is about relationships. Aren't we all somehow roped together as humanity, as inhabitants of a city, nationals of a country, or as neighbors? This emphasis on relationships underlines the importance of the permanent process and institutions to manage relationships. For states, it is the United Nations. For community conflict, there are peace councils. If economies need critical infrastructure to enable prosperity, then societies need architectures for peace that moderate diversity, build trust, and solve problems. My final story is about a river. What you see here is the 9-stage matrix of conflict escalation developed by Austrian conflict researcher Friedrich Glasel. Glasel likens escalation dynamics to a downward flowing river that destructs one dike after the other as the water takes up speed and strength. Peace professionals construct dikes to prevent escalation and reconstruct them to protect the achievements of de-escalation. In the words of Glasel, it is easy to float downstream with a current, but it requires a tremendous effort to row against the stream. What this story underlines is that peace professionals are working against the stream. And this does not always make them very well liked by those pursuing violence and coercion as a political or economic strategy. This is why courage for peace is so important. The metaphor also underlines that mediation is just one of several instruments for the prevention of conflict escalation and protection, de-escalation achievement. Definitions of mediation highlight that it is a process to which disputants consent to voluntarily, that involves a professional, impartial, and mutually accepted third party, and that produces outcomes that are mutually owned by the parties. These characteristics position mediation into the array of conflict management and resolution instruments in which decision power over the outcome rests with the parties. This differentiates mediation from power strategies where this is no longer the case, and which you find towards the right of the spectrum. Then Glasel also illustrates that you cannot mediate everything. He shows that there are different instruments for different stages in escalation, and that mediation as an instrument is best applied in the mid-range of escalation. When violent conflict transforms into all-out war, different forms of high-power diplomacy are necessary. And this is a very important differentiation to recall if we see a conflict environment that is marked, of course, by very high intense conflict. Friends and colleagues, I think these stories illustrate some of the key practical dimensions of the peace mediation sector, and which I have tried to condense in the following points, which you see here. The peace mediation sector builds on a network of exceptional people which define the heart of an agency for peace. The pathway to peace is a permanent process, like an expedition through a mountain range. There is the quality that no one finds peace alone, highlighting the importance of third parties. And there is also the idea that mediation, or the fact that mediation is one of various instruments in the toolbox of conflict management and transformation, and that you cannot mediate everything. With these characteristics of peace mediation clarified, I would like to invite you now to the third part of the lecture, in which I will reflect on its institutionalization. At its core, the sector has institutionalized as a system of specialized NGOs and dedicated units within the United Nations, the EU, and countries like Switzerland, Norway, Finland, Germany, Qatar, or others. Governments have been funders and actors at the same time, and this has shaped complex competitive dynamics, including competition for processes and successes between governments and between governments and NGOs, and competition for funding between NGOs. A key challenge for the sector has also been the duty of care for its human resources, given the sometimes impossible circumstances that they work in. The membership of the Peace Support Network, which you see here, is a good indicator for the size of the NGO footprint. These organizations offer network, convening, analysis, devising, programming, or training activities, and are all united in being primarily action-oriented. Over the last 3 decades, several organizations have stayed committed to only focusing on regions where they have built local peace networks for decades. Others have diversified to respond to a multitude of donor interests on specific topics, constituencies, and conflict countries. Key to observe however, is that the primary business of the sector in recent years has been about mediation support, rather than mediation processes per se. What this means is sanctified in the overview of Switzerland mediation portfolio. Activities include dialogue support to help enable and structure conversations, facilitation to accompany parties to structure a negotiation process, negotiation support to provide expertise relevant for the negotiations, mediation support to provide expertise to shape processes and content for the negotiations, and finally, mediation, which means the leadership as a third party of a process. This portfolio reminds us of the need for nuance when we speak about mediation and recalls that the activities remain within the framework of mediation, meaning that the parties remain in control of the outcomes and that the third parties shape processes without coercion. Now, let's get also to money and look at how these activities are in fact paid for. And overall, the sector conducts its activities on a rather moderate, with a rather moderate financial footprints. My estimates suggest that the sector has a budget of at least $300 million in 2023. This estimate builds on the publicly available figures from peace mediation NGOs that do not take account of budget from relevant government, UN, and EU units, which are not in the public domain. We can see large and medium-sized clusters of around 50 million and 25 million, and smaller organizations having budget below 10 million. In financial terms, therefore, the sector compares to a small boutique of access, know-how, and expertise. The International Committee of the Red Cross is 6 times bigger than the entire NGO sector. The budget represents about 0.01% of world military expenditure of $2.4 trillion in 2023. But if we want to be a bit more concrete, the peace mediation sector compares to about 10 meters of a nuclear-powered submarine. Now, insiders lament that they could do so much more with more funding. Instead, only those opportunities are funded that offer reasonable chances of success and a photo opportunity for senior leadership. Overall, there is no competition for work, but a competition for funding and media attention. Looking at the funding of the sector, therefore, there is a clear message to send. It is time to invest in peacemaking and not war-making. Now comes the next question, where you might answer, okay, everyone asks for more money, but what do you have to show? And I ask the question, what can you buy for $50 million in the peace mediation field? So to answer this question, I studied the annual report of the 2023 of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And what we can see are about 6 clusters of results. Half a dozen outcomes on highly localized conflict dynamics, half a dozen initiatives to support much bigger political processes, targeted contributions to diffuse great power competition, a sector-wide forum and new regional formats, program development and innovation on cross-cutting themes, and secret activities that cannot be reported publicly. The only item I would add is the exceptional quality of human resources that are both a repository of skill and knowledge and that define the organization's network value. I think these clusters of results could be extrapolated to the rest of the sector and demonstrate the type of results the peace mediation sector produces currently. I also think that the clarity in communication about results and ambition are critical elements for managing expectations in this sector. Now, all of this you can buy for about 1.5 meters of a submarine. And if submarines are not your thing, I would invest into something like this rather. Now, let us recap. I've presented the contours of an era of radical uncertainty. That is radical because change is fast and happens at scale. And it is uncertain because present instruments and approaches to manage this change are either inadequate or non-existent. I have also argued that given the diverse range of dynamics of this era, it is important to find alternative approaches. Then I described the practical characteristics of peace mediation and analyzed the institutional dimensions of the mediation sector. I think we have now the foundations in place to reflect on the trajectories of continuity and change relevant for the adaptation of peace mediation practice to an era of radical uncertainty. Let us start with the obvious. Adaptation is in the DNA of the peace mediation sector for at least over a century. The sector builds on the attempts to institutionalize the idea of international mediation between states at the beginning of the 20th century. Only much later, the UN Charter codified mediation and good offices in Article 33. The good offices roles by states were then extended to the UN Secretary General, and successive generations of SGs took up these roles during the Cold War. After the Cold War, the United Nations and several governments took leading roles in facilitating peace agreements, such as in South Africa, Namibia, Cambodia, and many other contexts. Then came 9/11, with a wave of foreign military interventions and counter-terror policies. This era criminalized direct engagement with actors labeled as terrorist organizations and made private diplomacy much more complicated. However, given the lack of progress on the military front, European countries opened the political space for private mediation organization to conduct discrete dialogue with prescribed groups. It was a very, very busy period for the sector, and it exposed the limits of foreign interventions and traditional diplomacy because the realities of war and peace did not coincide with an institutional order based on sovereignty. In summary, then, peace mediation continuously evolved in parallel with the evolution of conflict dynamics. And this is why there should be nothing but confidence for the adaptation of the sector today. The next point is that adaptation is already taking place. Diplomats are back in the business of high-powered diplomacy to deal with increased superpower tensions, interstate wars and proxy wars. Going back to the Glasel model of conflict escalation, these are stage 7 to 9 conflict dynamics that require high-powered negotiations outside the framework of mediation. In these contexts in which government actors might be in the lead, the mediation sector supports larger processes with the maintenance of channels of communications, confidence-building measures, or resolving problems that cannot be resolved through traditional diplomacy. The value added of the sector is the relationship with powerful non-state actors, as well as its technical expertise that is relevant for the solution of problems in the de facto world. For the discussion of adaptation, this means that there is a degree of continuity that the sector should maintain. However, there's also a need for change. One area of change, in my view, is that the sector should become a much stronger voice to demystify conflict dynamics and what can be done against violent conflict. Such communication should disentangle the cold and calculated execution of violence and bring sober and impartial analysis back into the public domain. After all, as Professor Chris Kramer reminds us, civil war is not a stupid thing, and shaping a voice that brings analysis from the de facto world to global capitals would be a real asset, especially if it comes with the professionalism and impartiality of the sector. Another change is that the sector should open up to quickly become better at partnering. At this point, Its primary strength lies within a network of individuals with government, humanitarian, or activist backgrounds. But there are many other communities that work within the framework of dispute resolution and mediation. The CBI Global Network illustrates a strong mediation network with substantial private sector expertise, especially around large footprint investments. There are also many peacemakers in cities that connect through networks of violence reduction and prevention. The bigger message is that the peace mediation sector should consider itself as a segment of expertise and know-how that is part of the new diplomacies. This was a field of study dear to Professor Mohamedou. He emphasized the multi-thematic foundations of diplomacy across many constituencies and argued that diplomacy can remain alive as long as it can remain an integrator of interaction on many levels. Let us now shift to the non-kinetic nature of conflictivity associated to the era of radical uncertainty. Given the spread and scale of impact from systemic change, we will see a continuous spread of political turbulence and violent conflict at subnational levels. We are already seeing such evolutions today in countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, Mexico, and the other countries that you've seen previously at the ACLAID overview. The task for adaptation, therefore, is to project the political acquis of peace mediation, the practical acquis of peace mediation, closer to the realities of conflict systems. We have to disaggregate conflict. We should not speak about Sudan as one conflict, but about the 8 violent conflicts that make up Sudan's meta-conflict system. Because many such systems are highly localized, it is important to have much stronger local peace mediation footprints. Let us call these footprints the creation of local peace mediation societies. In fact, what such a vision would involve, on the one hand, is to strengthen local peace capacities, and on the other hand, strengthen efforts to federate capacities into a regional or global network. Such an arrangement could order the capacities for peacemaking along localized conflict systems that can engage into the painstaking work to diffuse one local conflict after the other, while constructing an offer that peace is more desirable than war. International arrangements for such mediation support would be similar to the International Federation of the Red Cross that supports local Red Cross and Red Crescent action. Allow me to sum up the key points. With respect to adaptation. Adaptation is already happening. The sector assists government actors and agencies in the production of results that can only emerge outside the realm of traditional diplomacy. There is a degree of continuity. Civil war terror dynamics continue, and the sector can activate its full range of mediation support activities. There are opportunities for change, especially in the realm of communication to demystify conflict dynamics and opportunities for peace, and throughout partnering with like-minded professional networks. Finally, conflict dynamics of interlocking crises in the era of radical uncertainty require the diffusion of peace mediation practices within local conflict systems. This is akin to sharing a software that can then be applied locally through peace mediation societies and that are supported at the global and regional level by an IFRC for peace. Friends and colleagues, we have reached the end of my lecture. And the good news for you is that you can go back to work soon. While I have another 5 years in the framework of the Nagulendran Chair in Peace Mediation to review, detail, and expand the analysis you just heard. In the framework of the chair, I will give a class on peace mediation and conflict resolution at the Institute that will in fact start 8:15 tomorrow morning. For those students who are in the room, see you there. I will also accompany the intellectual journeys of the students and continue to study the evolution of the peace mediation sector and the application of peace approaches in the context of large-scale investments and cities. A new line of curiosity is the topic of peace mediation and China. Holding the Nagulendran Chair in peace mediation in this era of radical uncertainty comes with responsibilities. For me, these responsibilities are about nurturing the courage to engage with the world as it is and to help inspire the changes that result in a more desirable present and future for people and planet. They are about helping others to step back, to have a better perspective on their strategic environment and their role within it. And they are about developing new ideas and frameworks with operational value. As a professor of practice, I'm embracing these responsibilities in the service of nurturing a new generation of leadership in peace mediation. Let us take time to understand the other, tend our own inner garden for the tasks ahead, and build the communities to walk far. Thank you very much.
Achim, Professor Wennmann. I think I needed a few minutes to breathe before having the honor to moderate what has been a very profound exploration of ideas in the form of an inaugural lecture. But let me start by saying that your dedication in honor of your late colleague and dear friend was deeply moving and stirring. Let me also state that your inaugural lecture felt more like a culmination of practice and ideas and an articulation of what many in our sector talk about, attempt to navigate, and are utterly absorbed by, if not being swallowed or consumed by. And in many ways, for many in this room who are practitioners, who are diplomats for peace, who are the new generation, you've laid out in the spirit of Dag Hammarskjöld signposts, markings along the way at a pivotal moment of radical uncertainty. Colleagues and friends, I trust that you'd agree that Professor Wennmann, my dear friend, and I must confess bias, but still objectivity to a certain degree. Bias because he is indeed a friend, a sparring partner on matters of peace mediation and other matters, which we won't get into. But I think we can agree that he has, in fact, laid out, as he put it, the contours of an era of radical uncertainty and the implications, and more importantly, opportunities presented for peace mediation and the advancement of peace writ large. In a professorial manner, he so swiftly concluded and moved into a kind of syllabus of activity, which didn't allow for us to give the necessary due round of applause, if you can join me in doing so first. I have 4 points of reflection or observations in light of the density of work put forward, which is setting an agenda for many of us to continue to reflect upon. Prior to this inaugural lecture, mindful that you are also represented here by your beloved family, I was sharing with Achim that this is such a pivotal moment, not only for himself, for the Graduate Institute, but for our sector. And you have demonstrated why that is the case. But there are a couple of terms that stand out to me in what you've presented today, in the form of your inaugural lecture. The one that was protruding was a term unexpected: imagination. And you used it in 3-fold form: public imagination, strategic imagination, and moral imagination. Help us understand the interrelations between what is public in our imagination, strategic, and moral in the advancement of peace in an era of radical uncertainty. Achim.
Thank you, Itonde, for your words of appreciation and your commentary. And I think I can say it, that we are indeed friends, but we are also competitors when we play tennis. So it's a very deep friendship. So thank you for putting the ball up with the expectations of making an ace. Look, public, strategic, moral imagination. I think there are, if we are looking at the current day coverage of war zones, we are seeing that there is more efforts which are put into presentations of warfare that attempt to convince the viewer that one or the other view is right. But it is not about facilitating the understanding of what really takes place and why. What is the functional and strategic significance of a specific campaign out of a military perspective or in a broader strategy? So this is, I think, where there is a lot of work that the sector can help with to disentangle that type of expansion of the public imagination about conflict and war. Then, with a strategic imagination, what we are seeing in Europe and many other countries these days is that the imagination stops at military budgets and investments in military budget, and that's strategically unsound. Because if there's one thing that we've seen from an analysis of the conflict dynamics going forward, is that yes, there is a military dimension to these dynamics, the kinetic dimension I spoke about, but there is so much more. And if we only invest into one specific activity, we'll ultimately be all much less secure in the end. And then the moral imagination is somewhat deeper. It is how, if you have an upbringing or a socialization in a regular European countries, you have your bounds of imagination of what should be right and what should be wrong. But if you grow up in a context which is fundamentally different, your assessment of what are moral bounds of decisions and compromise are very different. And I think this is particularly third parties that come from outside the conflict zones have to be particularly sensitive to the propositions for peace that are outside the bounds of their own moral imagination. So I ping the ball back to you.
There's another term that was building from the references, the public, the strategic, the moral imagination, and was also a kind of call, if you will, to the peace mediation sector, which was in the form of communications. It stood out strongly. And you referenced it both with regards to how organizations present themselves. I could feel many colleagues in the room wiggling a little bit to see annual reports being analyzed with such scrutiny, which is rich and helpful. And it's making a compelling case for why, as you put it, it's time to invest in peacemaking and not war-making. Extremely compelling. But you also use the term communication with regards to the, quote, demystification of conflict dynamics. Could you please reflect more on the importance of making a compelling case for peace?
So first of all, to all colleagues who write annual reports, there are people who read them, and thank you very much for writing them, because they are, in a sense, an evidence base on the evolution of the sector. The reason why this is so important is that a lot of what happens in the sector is really under wraps. It's discreet, it's not visible. And so annual reports, and of course Chatham House conferences, are the only source you can have access to as a shareholder in peace mediation. So keep on writing annual reports, please. Then on the demystification of conflict dynamics, I think it's important to go to disaggregate and go back to the very localized origins of many conflicts. I think if we are eating every conflict as if we would eat an elephant in one gulp, and as I briefly mentioned, if we think Sudan is just a conflict, we're mistaken. There are 8 larger conflicts. There are multiple dozens of smaller conflict settings. So going deep down and demystifying the conflict dynamics, also understanding the composition of the very groups who are fighting war. You see large rebel groups being essentially described as bands of terrorists. But they're essentially seizable groups that have structures, very clever people to organize military activities. And if they would be business people, they would be winning management prizes, because they're running very, very difficult activities in a very hostile environment through global networks of business and politics. So that's the type of demystification that I think a public would be ready to absorb and would be wanting to understand, to make sense of what is happening in the world. And I think the peace mediation sector is in a unique position to do this, because of its access on the ground, because of the people and the voices it can bring into this demystification exercise, and because of the professionalism and independence it has.
Two more observations, and we open for further discussion, dialogue, and questions. You referred to, in an era of radical uncertainty, the limits and extents of diplomacy, that is, diplomacy conducted by states in the advancement of peace and security. How do you understand the balance between, the complementarity between state diplomacy and specifically peace diplomacy? You referenced various states who invest in the advancement of peace, directly and by way of other institutions, and the role of independent, non-state actors, and the complementarity between the two in light of the limits as described, particularly now. Achim.
Thank you. So I think particularly in a city like Geneva that is so heavy on government representation, it's sometimes a little bit awkward to argue that government diplomats are not the only diplomats that exist out there, or that government diplomats have a monopoly on diplomacy. They don't have necessarily a monopoly even inside their countries, as sometimes military actors are much more active on diplomacy, or presidential officers, or specific dedicated government thematic leads who work on diplomacy, on climate change, or other topic. And to come to your question, I think that recognizing the diversities of diplomacies is so important, because as a government diplomat, by definition, there is a limit of political spaces which you can access. And if you would like to access representative of very, very complicated political figures somewhere deep down in the jungle or somewhere else, you will not go there through a government representative, but through actors who have the specific access. And these are collected in the private diplomacy field. The same is true with respect to the expertise that you need to have access to. Governments cannot have all the expertise within the confines of their ministries, or even in government, but it is outside government sector. So this is where Professor Mohamedou's notion of diplomacy is the integrative function, being the integrator of all these different types of access opportunities and expertise opportunities. It's where it's so important, and that's where the complementarity is. This is not a competitive game where I do it because you will also do it, but it's where we in fact work in tandem, and different peace spaces with different levels of access in order to convince parties that peace is somewhat more interesting than the continuation of war.
Achim, a final question, observation in this light. You drew upon a tradition of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement in conclusion, and specifically referred to a federation, if you will, or rather an IFRC for peace. I find this both provoking and compelling. I should reveal a bias, again, having worked for the Federation in terms of humanitarian diplomacy. I believe in the model, and I think there is something deeply compelling about how peace mediation can build off of existing structures. Here in this room, you have leaders from the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, not least of which being the Vice President, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, I see him. The ICRC, You have colleagues representing the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue who come out of a longer tradition from Geneva, Henri Dunant. And you have the Geneva Call. Can you reflect more of what was intended by this reference? And I heard in particular the reference to ownership and rootedness at a national level through networks, correct?
So I think it is, there are a number of elements to say. One is that the characteristics of the peace mediation competence and capacities are in people that are in places of conflict. So what already exists is a network characteristic that defines the workings of the peace mediation sector, in my understanding. At the same time, you have a completely diversified and distributed occurrence of conflict dynamics and existence of conflict systems. This reality is not made for vertically organized, horizontal, hierarchical institutions, but it requires institutions that are working along network characteristics. And this is, I think, if we are looking at institutions that have scaled networks and that are in fact administering networks to provide support to actors on the ground, then the IFRC, in terms of an institutional structure, is a very good inspiration for a type of vision for the future institutionalization of the sector. What it is not is to create another vertically, hierarchically oriented organization where change goes top-down and where the result of peace is the outcome of a programming exercise.
This deserves another part of the lecture. We have time for questions, correct? Let's open the floor, in particular to, as you described in conclusion, the new generation, but I do want to draw upon expertise present in the room within this sector. Any questions, observations that may come, I will refer to certain individuals, should hands not be raised. I see hands arising. I see top right, very good. Do we have a microphone? Okay, we're already distributing. Now I have to reveal another bias. Hassan, please, Interpeace representative in Kenya, if you would.
Thank you very much. I'm Hassan Ismail, I'm the Interpeace country rep. Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful lecture. Just getting to my question is, what will inspire investment in peacemaking beyond the moral imagination for countries that have franchised weapon and arm production as an economic empire, and they're exporting arms for purpose of economic gain? So what will inspire them to invest in peace? Similar to that question is, what is the moral balance between countries that invest in peace, yet they invest more in war because they produce the guns, they produce the arms, and thank you very much.
Let's see further hands. We'll take a few if that's okay. We have just here in the middle with the red sweater, also in front. Alexander, if you would go ahead while mics are being passed.
Thank you. You said many nice things about peacemakers, but peacemakers have many qualities, but not the quality of self-criticism. And to say the truth, our collective track record in peacemaking over the last decades is not terrific. Most of the major conflicts today have been the object of elaborate peace processes, be it in the Sudan or in Eastern DRC or in Ukraine. Two of the three largest UN peacekeeping missions have been expelled by their host countries in Mali and in Congo. So do you think that your chair should also take time to think about what is not working and what we should do differently? Thank you.
Thank you. My colleague will forgive me, as I did not want to give two in a row to Interpeace, and we had the Madame first here, just behind. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Yulia. I'm from Ukrainian refugee. I want to thank you for the definition of peace mediation as about relationships, as a practice. Because oftentimes when I see peace builders come to my country, they try to actually marginalize the interests of the marginalized already, but going from the ground and really working out on the relationship, I think is the core, and I'm very grateful for that. And my question is, how do you see the connection between peace, mediation, and security? How it affects? What is your vision about that? Thank you.
Achim, we'll take one more if you agree. Sure. Perfect. Just in front of you there. Just right. She's holding the. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to Professor Wennmann for this, and thank you for this inspiring lecture. I highly appreciate your explanation of the imagination, the public, the strategic and moral imagination, and also your emphasis on demystifying the dynamics of the conflict at local level. And you gave a good example of Sudan. And in as much as this focus at local level is important, also in mediation effort, this should not derail us from seeing the bigger picture or the bigger narrative of the conflict as what is happening now in Israel-Palestine. So that the genocide, the ongoing genocide in Gaza, is not seen as separate from the 75 years of occupation. And I was wondering if you would like to say more about this dynamic between the bigger narrative and the local conflicts. Thank you.
Would you allow one more?
Sure, go ahead.
Please, if you would.
Gilles Garbonnier, the Vice President of the ICRC, and as I was kindly referenced by Itonde, before I take this opportunity first to congratulate you, Dr. Achim Wennmann, for taking on this new and very important chair in peace mediation, and also, of course, to thank John Nagulendran and the family for supporting this initiative. I think it's a fraction of an inch of a submarine that goes into a good investment. Now, my question is the following. I think you very rightly put really the onus and the focus on local dynamics and the role of local actors in supporting peace dynamics and the role of mediation at this level. And I would like to hear a bit more from you. What are your implicit reflection on the causal mechanisms between these efforts that are being scattered around, for instance, in Sudan, in the diverse conflicts that we have, and how this plays out at the end of the day, or it doesn't play out, and what are the connections with the macro dynamics, with the top leaders, in that case the two generals, and some of their supporters in neighboring countries and beyond, because it seems that it seemed to be a missing link, and I would love to hear a bit more about how to make that link a solid one.
Why don't we respond now to these sets of questions, and we'll open the floor again. I see to here in the back, please.
So I hope I can make justice to all. And I think that on the first question of the how we can essentially find investment in peace while so many countries are structured essentially in a hegemonic type of way to support war. My answer to this question is these countries are never just one country. There is a segment of a country which has interest in a war economy. There are different sectors and corporations that are servicing that economy. Then there are other segments of that same country and that societies that have another set of interests. So understanding countries not as a unitary entity, but as the conflagration of a lot of sometimes competing interests is an entry point to find those who support peace within that very country, while the complexity and diversities of the countries are such that you need to accept that there are interests present in one country that are not always mutually supportive. So that's one direction. The self-criticism of the peace mediation sector. Alexandre, I think sometimes the self-criticism goes too far, because I think the peace mediation community can be much more positive with what it can achieve and has achieved. I've put the results of your organization out there. As a result, I could put other organizations out there, and I would just also put it into the context of the kind of investment that you put into outcomes that are achievable. Because if you see all the regressions of conflict which you have mentioned, if we want to put it on a very simple financial framework, the militarization side had a much bigger budget and had, in a sense, much better access to sell its role. So I think that is where academia and also political economy analysis is useful to assess and analyze these so-called defeats, which I sometimes would argue the defeat is not of the peace mediation sector, but the defeat is that some governments and actors are encouraging political stakeholders with a message that it's okay to use war and violence as a political strategy, and you can get away with it. And this encouragement is not okay, and we have to put back. And then to say that the peace mediators failed, I don't buy it. But I think so. My message is is more room for positive messaging, while being very clear about the political economy dynamics which are happening in conflict zones and around peace agreements. Then we had the relationship between peace mediation and security. I think here and this is a lesson I learned from my own engagement and my own work on the negotiated exits from organized crime, where in transitional moments, particularly when it involves criminal activities or exits from criminal activities, there needs to be that moments where you create a space for actors involved in morally reputable or criminal activities to transform and change. But then, when the moment is up, and one says, okay, up on this moment we can change, and if you continue what you're doing, you need to have credible institutions and instruments at your disposition to target these individuals that this is not okay. And that is where you need the right dosage of security instruments at your disposition. Where I see the problem right now is that the world lives on a complete oversubscription of antibiotics. And they only invest in antibiotics, and which is my metaphor for military equipment. And if you ask any doctor, if you only take antibiotics, you weaken the body in the long run. Then on the local conflict dynamics and explaining this a little bit more, Gilles. I think here I come back again to political economy analysis and the case of Sudan. It is for me always an incredible revelation when I hear a UN special envoy on Sudan, a former special envoy on Sudan, speak that they ran a peace process without attention to the economy. And if there is one thing in Sudan, and if you want to understand the dynamics of the RSF and the fracture, it's about gold markets. It's about how the RSF, in fact, positioned itself to take control of this business. with the relationship with other armed groups, with the relationship of investors from the Gulf, and so forth. So if you can't get to this type of degree of analysis, where you get in fact, you weave through the political narratives which are out there and come to the gist of what motivates people in warfare, then. And you are not blinded by the politics of things, and accept that warfare can be a strategy, a business strategy, rather than a political strategy in a specific context run by a rebel group. Then this is the type of granularity of understanding that I think is useful to be put out in the public imagination, and that in academia and through the higher voice, the stronger voice in the peace mediation sector, one can put out there in order to provide a more balanced understanding of conflict dynamics. Did I get all the questions?
You did, I believe. We'll open for another round. Please, Maria here. And then we'll come with the red sweater just in the middle and the gentleman in front.
Well, thank you very much. First, I would like, of course, to congratulate Professor Wennmann and to thank our moderator, President Kakoma, for helping us to delve a little bit more into the very, very interesting and rich topics introduced in the inaugural lecture. My question will go maybe to the third, let's say, theme that was evoked during the discussion, which is the complementarity between government diplomats and private diplomacy, and is a question of legitimacy, because I think we have covered the basis in terms of independence, expertise, but when it comes to having this legitimacy as mediators and even de facto negotiators, where do we place ourselves as peace builders and private diplomats, so to speak, beyond or besides the fault of a government and the mandate that derives from that? So, thank you.
Please, if you would, and if there are students in the room, please raise your hand as well, if you would.
Yeah. Hello, is it on or not?
It is.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was extremely stimulating, and many of the situations you described, we have lived them personally in Africa, where you see conflicts giving rise to all personal and local conflicts to also find a way of getting reckonings done. My question is about the high-level diplomacy. I'm very much, as a cultural anthropologist, interested in the trends in how social behavior and moral thinking comes about or can be changed. And I see there is an enormous influence at the moment of a movie, Netflix, The Diplomat. And a friend of mine recommended it as something very great. I started to look at it. I thought, this is so cynical again. This is just making everybody understand that diplomats are just out for power, out for personal gain. They're an infectious lot. So I think that if you want to have support for diplomacy and respect for it, and you want to take care of this economic aspect of peacemaking in an honest way, we have to be careful about what does the public perceive. Could you tell me something about that? Thank you.
We have some students as well here, please, if you would.
Hi. Yeah, so my question is more surrounding radical insurgency. So I just want to talk about Colombian peace processes. So there's been extensive peace processes within Colombia, with the establishment of total peace by Gustavo Petro and the peace accord signed by Juan Manuel Santos. And so there's a desire within Colombia for peace, but there's hundreds of humanitarian leaders who have been murdered, and crime is in the rise, as was mentioned within the presentation. So I just want to know, with agreements and processes in mind, how can peace be enacted within countries that are facing corruption and instability, and what role do local leaders have to create change?
If you would, sir.
Thank you. I am a member of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, and I appreciate a lot your talk on mediation, because it's an alternative to war. It's an alternative to violence to solve conflicts. And it reminds me of Dominic Bata. Maybe you don't know him. He was an Englishman working in Brazil in the favelas. And he was mediating as a private between violent groups in the favela fighting together. And he had quite a lot of success, and he taught us, he came to Geneva, and he taught us restorative circles. It's a way to mediate between many people in conflicts. And he used nonviolent communication of Marshall Rosenberg, using feeling and needs, and by empathy, and just communicating to one another of the fighters the feeling and needs, so that they could be responsible of proposing a solution to the needs of the adverse. And I think I find it very useful, and it reminds me of also the possibilities of to use these restorative circles to the public for creating an alternative to wars and using nonviolent civilian defense. Do you know of nonviolent civilian defense? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
This is my question.
Shall we take a couple more? There's a gentleman just here with the mic.
Well, I'm a student, so
perfect.
3 days in class, so just practical questions, because I don't know as much theory.
When does class start? Yes, please.
No, but yeah, specifically, I wanted to know what are there any ethical conducts a mediator should follow, and let's see how strict should we follow, and what are like the overarching principles. Thank you.
So we'll allow Professor Wennmann to respond here, and we'll take one last round. And I see the hands raised. Madame Schwab-Wavida, please.
On Netflix, I think let's do a Netflix on peace mediation. So that's the next an interesting project to engage in. And on the Colombian peace process, I think it is an example of what I mentioned in this picture of that peace is an expedition through a mountain range. No, the comprehensive peace agreement would not be the answer for everything all at once, so that there is peace in Colombia. And as we are seeing now, there are many, many, many other peace spaces that have opened, and also the nature of the organizational nature of violence itself has transformed. So the actors have completely changed. And that, for me, is that ultimate challenge to when you solve one segment of the conflict spectrum, you need to, in fact, keep on working to make sure to work on the other types of conflict that are also there. And Colombia is, of course, a very complex environment, and with the Paz Total strategy, the current president looks at dealing with a lot of the conflict systems all at once again. But if you take my class, we have a whole semester to make sense of that. I think the issue of relationship, which you mentioned, also in civilian work, relationship is a big word, but don't forget what it really means. It means to create a bond. What it means in the mediation sector, it creates a bond with another person, and an emotional bond sometimes, so that you can convince that person that peace is more attractive than continuing war. And on the one hand, there is a kind of a functional purpose to that relationship, but it is work, and the moral. It's a long discussion on the ethics, but I think here one of the primary motivators is to ensure the primacy of life. So to be short and to allow another round of questions, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I believe there is a mic already here on the left.
Thank you, Mr. Kakoma, for moderating, and congratulations, Professor Wennmann. I'm a second-year master's student and a practitioner. As students, what should we look out for? What are the new learnings, especially looking into past successes and lessons learned, and combined with the evolving nature of mediation, which has varying influence depending on the respect or lack of for treaties and processes, especially in IOs. What are some lessons that we should be looking out for? Thank you.
And I believe there's a mic already. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Mayuen Galwet. I'm the regional program coordinator for Geneva Call, in charge of the Africa region. First, thank you, Professor Wennmann, and also President Kakoma for the great event. My question is actually an extension to one of the questions that was asked, and it's more about the leverages that mediators like all of us working in the public sphere, like international organizations, NGOs, what kind of leverages do they have in comparison to mediators that come from states? Basically, you see in different ongoing peace processes, you tend to have basically mediators coming from specific states having a lot of leverage for a myriad of reasons. You mentioned the case of the RSF and the economic aspects that come with it, but in other contexts there are also other issues that pop up that makes some states more likely to succeed in leveraging a peace mediation or a peace process. What kind of leverages do we have that we can use effectively in the public sphere that can really motivate actors to conflict to resort to peace? Thanks.
Thank you. We have just a couple of more already identified. Please, Madame.
Hello. I'm a lawyer, and I'm just about to start a mediation course tomorrow with the University of Geneva. I have two questions. My first question is, shouldn't mediation for peace work towards establishing and ensuring that international law is applied rather than moral principles? There's a lot of discussions about moral principles, and moral principles are always a little bit fuzzy and can, differ from a region to another. However, international law is key, and there has been a trend of having war as the last resort, and we moved on to another concept of preemptive war. And what, shouldn't mediation work towards that? That's my first question. The second question
Could we stick to one just to allow others? That's a brilliant question.
Okay, the second one is just on self-criticism. And as much as you were very keen on, talking about the detailed analysis of the various mediation organizations, don't you think that it's important and key to doing a very thorough and honest analysis of what has failed? If we consider that 1945 was the establishment of the United Nations, and we are, I believe, today in a very dire situation from a conflict perspective. Thank you.
Please, Madame, if you would.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you for this event. My name is Jackie Lee. I'm a first-year student here in the MINT program. I wanted to circle back to a question I think that was respectfully missed in the first round of questions. It was specific to Gaza, and I'll try to characterize it correctly. I believe the question related to having the peace discussion about current negotiations, about the conflict, but not glossing over the 75-year history of the occupation of that territory. So how do we have the conversation about peace mediation today while also making sure that that historical context is taken into consideration?
Thank you for that. We have a final question here from Joao Boavida, Timor-Leste. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It would be good, Professor, to understand a bit more how your peace mediation approach would work in situations of post-conflict societies. that remain further away from the peace initiative attentions, such as Timor-Leste, and where the previous impact of war and conflict still remain very much the case, or even worse. Thank you.
That's a new definition of grilling after the 3 rounds. Where can we look for learning? My argument would be, don't look for learning only within the sector. Just go broader, because there's a lot of fascinating practice from business-associated mediators and conflict resolution specialists on how they moderate and manage conflict dynamics around large-scale investments. That's a huge source of inspiration. The same happens also at the urban level. How a very deep experience of reducing urban violence. They are extremely rich sources of inspiration, and I think I was alluding to this in my lecture, saying that the mediation sector has to be a little bit more open-minded to look outside of its bounds of its specific application of interstate and civil war history. The comment on international law, it's from a peace mediation perspective, it's a difficult question, because there are so many different perspectives on the law itself, particularly if it is applied with various degrees of consistency. And there is a very, very strong constituency in the world that has lost confidence in international law and in its inconsistent application. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work on it. On the contrary, it says that, well, if it should be respected by everyone, then let it be respected by everyone. But from conversations we've had in other contexts, there are countries who literally don't give a damn about law because they hold power. And so that is something that particular actors who work in the de facto world are very aware of. So it's a much more complicated system, a complicated answer than just to say, well, we all respect international law and we'll be fine. And the same applies to the historical rootings of many conflicts. The current war in Gaza is not a new conflict. It's just a new episode of an existing conflict. And that's what I mean. If we're looking at conflict dynamics, very localized, let's also look at the historical successions of what has happened in the past. So one cannot isolate conflict events as if they are just happen to be something new. And I think that's very important in the case of Gaza, but in the case of many, many, many other conflict areas that are in conflict for decades. On the question of legitimacy and leverage, that I'm combining two questions. I think here I think the leverage and the legitimacy comes from the quality of the access and trust that a mediation actor has with the specific group that it is working with, or with the specific form of the parties in conflict that it is working for, if it is accepted. The acceptance by the other, that is the source of leverage that you can have. I remember one of the mediators on Aceh, Damien Kingsbury. It took him years of relationship with the GAM movement to have them understand that they get, in fact, much more out of a future of their territory within the framework of Indonesia through high degrees of decentralization, rather than to go for an independent state. And it took, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years of exchanges, conversations, meetings, and so forth. And at one point, the leadership said, well, I think this is a future without war that is more attractive than keeping on fighting for independence. I hope I didn't make justice to all of the comments and questions. Thank you very much. If you allow me one final reflection.
Please.
One thing that is very important for me to emphasize what I mentioned is that the work on peace is never something you do alone. And the people who are with us in this are important to us. And so is my wife Soledad, who is here. Thank you, Sol. Because what people don't see is if you do this work and you come back at home at night, or when you have mediators who come back from their missions, either you come back home in your family life, or you're alone, but having a trusted partner to carry your experiences together is the best thing you can have in the world. So if you have a partner, just say thank you. So I say thank you, Sol. And I, of course, not just say thank you, Sol, I also say thank you, Santiago. Thank you.
Dear friends, colleagues, I think we can just simply continue the applause for what has been such, not just thought-provoking and substantive, but laying out, if I dare use the phrase in advance of the Summit of the Future, an agenda for navigating the contours of peacemaking in an era of radical uncertainty. And in that respect, you said it, and I quote, "It is time to invest in peacemaking and not war-making." I want to really acknowledge the generosity of Dorothy, John, who are here with us today in establishing the chair for peace mediation. You have demonstrated that such investments are impactful. So again, a round of applause for Professor Wennmann on his inaugural lecture as the Nagulendran Chair in Peace Mediation. Well done.
Thank you.